Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 23 of our reading of George Orwell's 1984. And we're going to go over the copyright information really quick. And by really quick, I mean really quick. We left it off on a cliffhanger last time because it appears that Winston and Julia were found out by the Thought Police. That was inevitable. Anyways, let's see here. It says, okay, this is a 1961 copy of the book. All rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So I'm taking that as permission. Anyways, in the last one, things looked bad. Well, anyway, Winston was talking how the proles were probably the hope for, overthrowing the party and stuff like that. And that's when this happened. We're going to reread this part right here. "We are the dead," he said. "We are the dead," echoed Julia dutifully. "You are the dead," said an iron voice behind them. They sprang apart. Winston's entrails seemed to have turned into ice. He could see the white all around the irises of Julia's eyes. Her face had turned a milky yellow. The smear of rouge that was still on each cheekbone stood out sharply against, almost as though unconnected with the skin beneath. "You are the dead," repeated the iron voice. "It was behind the picture," breathed Julia. "It was behind the picture," said the voice. "Remain exactly where you are. Make no movements until you are ordered." It was starting at last. They could do nothing except stand gazing into one another's eyes. To run for life, to get out of the house before it was too late. No such thought occurred to them. Unthinkable to disobey the iron voice from the wall. There was a snap as though a catch had been turned back, and a crash of breaking glass. The picture had fallen to the floor, uncovering the telescreen behind it. "Now they can see us," said Julia. Now we can see you," said the voice. "Stand out in the middle of the room. Stand back to back. Clasp your hands behind your head. Do not touch one another." They were not touching, but it seemed to him that he could feel Julia's body shaking, or perhaps it was merely the shaking of his own. He could just stop his teeth from chattering, but his knees were beyond his control. There was a sound of trampling boots below, inside the house. And outside, the yard seemed to be full of men. Something was being dragged across the stones. The woman singing had stopped abruptly. There was a long, rolling clang, as though a washtub had been flung across the yard, and then a confusion of angry shouts, which ended in a yell of pain. "The house is surrounded," said Winston. "The house is surrounded," said the voice. He heard Julia snap her teeth together. "I suppose we may as well say goodbye," she said. "You may as well say goodbye," said the voice, and then another, quite different voice, a thin, cultivated voice, which Winston had the impression of having heard before, struck in. "And by the way, while we are on the subject, here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." Something crashed on the bed behind Winston's back. The head of a ladder had been thrust through the window and had burst in the frame. Someone was climbing through the window. There was a stampede of boots up the stairs. The room was full of solid men in black uniforms, with iron-shod boots on their feet and truncheons in their hands. Winston was not trembling any longer. Even his eyes he barely moved. One thing alone mattered, to keep still and not give them an excuse to hit you. A man with a smooth prizefighter's jowl, in which the mouth was only a slit, paused opposite him, balancing his truncheon meditatively between thumb and forefinger. Winston met his eyes. The feeling of nakedness, with one's hands behind one's head and one's face and body all exposed, was almost unbearable. The man protruded the tip of a white tongue, licked the place where his lips should have been, and then passed on. There was another crash. Someone had picked up the glass paperweight from the table and smashed it to pieces on the hearthstone. The fragment of coral, a tiny crinkle of pink like a sugar rosebud from a cake, rolled across the mat. How small, thought Winston, how small it always was. There was a gasp and a thump behind him, and he received a violent kick on the ankle, which nearly flung him off his balance. One of the men had smashed his fist into Julia's solar plexus, doubling her over like a pocket ruler. She was thrashing about on the floor, fighting for breath. Winston dared not turn his head even by a millimeter, but sometimes her livid, gasping face came within an angle of his vision. Even in his terror, it was as though he could feel the pain in his own body. The deadly pain, which nevertheless was less urgent than the struggle to get back her breath. He knew what it was like, the terrible, agonizing pain, which was there all the while, but could not be suffered yet, because before all else, it was necessary to be able to breathe. Then two of the men hoisted her up by knees and shoulders and carried her out of the room, like a sack. Winston had a glimpse of her face, upside down, yellow and contorted, with the eyes shut and still with a smear of rouge on either cheek. That was the last he saw of her. He stood dead still. No one had hit him yet. Thoughts which came of their own accord but seemed totally uninteresting began to flit through his mind. He wondered whether they had got Mr. Charrington. He wondered what they had done to the woman in the yard. He noticed that he badly wanted to urinate, and he felt a faint surprise because he had done so only 2 or 3 hours ago. He noticed that the clock on the mantel said 9, meaning 21. But the light seemed too strong. Would not the light be fading at 2100 on an August evening? He wondered whether, after all, he and Julia had mistaken the time. He slept the clock around and thought it was 23 when really it was not 8:30 on the following morning. But he did not pursue the thought further. It was not interesting. There was another lighter step in the passage. Mr. Charrington came into the room. The demeanor of the black uniformed men suddenly became more subdued. Something had also changed in Mr. Charrington's appearance. His eyes fell on the fragments of the glass paperweight. "Pick up those pieces," he said sharply. The men stopped and obeyed. The Cockney accent had disappeared. Winston suddenly realized whose voice it was that he had heard a few moments ago on the telescreen. Mr. Charrington was still wearing his old velvet jacket, but his hair, which had been almost white, had turned black. Also, he was not wearing his spectacles. He gave Winston a single sharp glance, as though verifying his identity, and then paid no more attention to him. He was still recognizable, but he was not the same person any longer. His body had straightened and seemed to have grown bigger. His face had undergone only tiny changes that had nevertheless worked a complete transformation. The black eyebrows were less bushy, the wrinkles were gone, the whole lines of the face seemed to have altered. Even the nose seemed shorter. It was the alert, cold face of a man of about 35. It occurred to Winston that for the first time in his life, he was looking with knowledge at a member of the thought police. And moving on. I will say that this is probably going to get violent. Very violent. But I'm going to read this anyways. I don't really agree with what happens here, but here we go. Chapter 3. He did not know where he was. Presumably, he was in the Ministry of Love, but there was no way of making certain. He was in a high-ceilinged, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Concealed lamps flooded it with cold light, and there was a low, steady humming sound, which he supposed had something to do with the sound, well, with the air supply. A bench or shelf, just wide enough to sit on, ran around the wall, broken only by the door, and at the end opposite the door, a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. There were 4 telescreens, one in each wall. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had it had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van and driven him away. But he was also hungry, with a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. It might have been 24 hours since he had last eaten. It may have been 36. He did not know. Probably never would know whether it had been morning or evening when they arrested him. Since he was arrested, he had not been fed. He sat as still as he could on the narrow bench with his hands crossed on his knees. He had already learned to sit still. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen, but the craving for food was growing upon him. What he longed for above all was a piece of bread. He had an idea that there were a few breadcrumbs in his pocket, the pocket of his overalls. It was even possible, he thought, that because from time to time something seemed to tickle his leg, that he might be a sizable bit of crust there. In the end, the temptation to find out overcame his fear. He slipped a hand in his pocket. "Smith!" yelled the voice from the telescreen. 6079, Smith, W. Hands out pockets in the cells. He sat still again, his hands crossed his knee. Before being brought here, they had been taken to another place, which must have been an ordinary prison or a temporary lockup used by the patrols. He did not know how long he had been there, some hours at any rate, with no clocks and no daylight. It was hard to gauge the time. It was a noisy, evil-smelling place. They had put him into a cell similar to the one he was in now, but filthily dirty, and at all times crowded by 10 or 15 people. The majority of them were common criminals, but there were a few political prisoners among them. He had sat silent against the wall, jostled by dirty bodies, too preoccupied by fear and the pain in his belly to take much interest in his surroundings, but still noticing the astonishing difference in demeanor between the party prisoners and the others. The party prisoners were always silent and terrified, but the ordinary criminals seemed to care nothing for anybody. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely when their belongings were impounded, wrote obscene words on the floor, ate smuggled food, which they produced from mysterious hiding places in their clothes, and even shouted down the telescreen when it tried to restore order. On the other hand, some of them seemed to be on good terms with the guards, called them by nicknames, and tried to wheedle cigarettes through the spy hole in the doors. The guards, too, treated the common criminals with a certain forbearance, even when they had to handle them roughly. There was much talk about the forced labor camps to which most of the prisoners expected to be sent. It was all right in the camps, he gathered, so long as you had good contacts and knew the ropes. There were bribery, favoritism, and racketeering of every kind. There was homosexuality and prostitution. There was even illicit alcohol distilled from potatoes. The positions of trust were given only to the common criminals, especially the gangsters and the murderers, who formed a sort of aristocracy. All of the dirty jobs were done by the politicals. The politicals. There was a constant come and go of prisoners of every description: drug peddlers, thieves, bandits, black marketers, drunks, prostitutes. Some of the drunks were so violent with the other prisoners. Some of the drunks were so violent that the other prisoners had to combine to suppress them. An enormous wreck of a woman, aged about 60, with great tumbling breasts and thick coils of white hair, which had come down in her struggles, was carried in, kicking and shouting, by 4 guards, who each had to hold by 4 guards who had hold of her, one at each corner. They wrenched off the boots with which she'd been trying to kick them, and dumped her down across Winston's lap, almost breaking his thigh bones. The woman hoisted herself upright and followed them out by yelling an obscenity. Then noticed that she was sitting on something uneven and slid off of Winston's knees onto the bench. "Beg pardon, dearie," she said. "I wouldn't have sat on you, only the boogers put me there. They don't know how to treat a lady, do they?" She paused, patted her breast, and belched. "Pardon," she said. "I ain't myself quite." She leaned forward and vomited copiously on the floor. "That's better," she said, leaning back with closed eyes. "Never keep it down, that's what I say. Give it up while it's fresh on your stomach like." She revived, turned to have another look at Winston, and seemed immediately to take a fancy to him. She put a vast arm around his shoulder and drew him towards her, breathing beer and vomit onto his face. "What's your name, dearie?" she said. "Smith," said Winston. "Smith," said the woman. "That's funny. My name's Smith, too. Why," she said sentimentally, "I might be your mother." She might be, thought Winston. Be his mother. She was about the right age, the physique, and it was probable that people changed somewhat after 20 years in the forced labor camps. No one else had spoken to him. To a surprising extent, the ordinary criminals ignored the party prisoners, the pollets, they called them, was a sort of uninterested contempt. The party prisoners seemed terrified of speaking to anybody, and above all, of speaking to one another. Only once, when 2 party members, both women, were pressed close together on the bench, he overheard, amid the din of voices, a few hurried whispered words, and in particular a reference to something called Room 101, which he did not understand. It might be 2 or 3 hours ago that they had brought him there. The dull pain in his belly never went away, but sometimes it grew better and sometimes worse, and his thoughts expanded or contracted accordingly. When it grew worse, he thought only of the pain itself and of his desire for food. When it grew better, panic took a hold of him. There were moments where he foresaw the things that would happen to him with such actuality that his heart galloped and his breath stopped. He felt the smash of a truncheon on his elbows, the iron-shod boots on his shins. He saw himself groveling on the floor, screaming for mercy through broken teeth. He hardly thought of Julia. He could not fix his mind on her. He loved her and would not betray her, but that was only a fact known as he knew the rules of arithmetic. He felt no love for her, and he hardly even wondered what had happened to her. He thought oftener of O'Brien with a flickering hope. O'Brien must know that he had been arrested. The Brotherhood, he had said, never tried to save his members. But there was the razor blade. They would send the razor blade if they could. There would be perhaps 5 seconds before the guards could rush into the cell. The blade would bite into him and with a sort of burning coldness, and even the fingers that held it would be cut to the bone. Everything came back to his sick body, which shrank trembling from the smallest pain. He was not certain that he would use the razor blade even if he got the chance. It was more natural to exist from moment to moment, accepting another 10 minutes life, even with the certainty that there was torture at the end of it. Sometimes he tried to calculate the number of porcelain bricks in the wall of the cell. It should have been easy, but he always lost count at some point or another. More often he wondered where he was and what time of day it was. At one moment he felt certain that it was broad daylight outside, and at the next equally certain that it was pitch darkness. In this place he knew instinctively the lights would never be turned out. It was the place with no darkness. He saw now why O'Brien had seemed to recognize the illusion in the Ministry of Love. There were no windows. His cell might be at the heart of the building or against an outer wall. It might be 10 floors below ground or 30 above it. He moved himself mentally from place to place and tried to determine by the feeling of his body whether he was perched high in the air or buried deep underground. There was a sound of marching boots outside. The steel door opened with a clang. A young officer, a trim black uniformed figure who seemed to glitter all over with polished leather and whose pale, straight-featured face was like a wax mask, stepped smartly through the doorway. He motioned to the guards outside to bring in the prisoner they were leading. The poet Ampleforth stumbled into the cell. The door clanged shut again. Ampleforth made one or two uncertain movements from side to side, as though having some idea that there was another door to go out of, and then began to wander up and down the cell. He had not yet noticed Winston's presence. His troubled eyes were gazing at the wall about a meter above the level of Winston's head. He was shoeless. Large, dirty toes were sticking out of the holes in his socks. He was also several days away from a shave. A scrubby beard covered his face to the cheekbones, giving him an air of ruffianism that went oddly with his large, weak frame and nervous movements. Winston roused himself a little from his lethargy. He must speak to Ampleforth and risk the yell from the telescreen. It was even conceivable that Ampleforth was the bearer of the razor blade. Ampleforth, he said. There was no yell from the telescreen. Ampleforth paused, mildly startled. His eyes focused themselves slowly on Winston. "Ah, Smith," he said. "You too? What are you in for?" "To tell you the truth," he sat down awkwardly on the bench opposite Winston. "There is only one offense, is there not?" he said. "And have you committed it?" "Apparently I have." He put his hand on his forehead and pressed his temples for a moment, as though trying to remember something. "These things happen," he began vaguely. "I have been able to recall one instance, a possible instance. It was an indiscretion, undoubtedly. We were producing a definitive edition of the poems of Kipling. I allowed the word God to remain at the end of one line. I could not help it." He added almost indignantly, raising his face to look at Winston. "It was impossible to change the line. The rhyme was rod. Do you realize that there are only 12 rhymes to rod in the entire language? For days I had racked my brain. There was no other rhyme." The expression on his face changed. The annoyance passed out of it, and for a moment he looked almost pleased, a sort of intellectual warmth, the joy of the pedant who had found out some useless fact, shone through the dirt and scrubby hair. "Has it ever occurred to you," he said, "that the whole history of English poetry has been determined by the fact that the English language lacks rhymes?" No, that particular thought had never occurred to Winston, nor in the circumstances did it strike him as very important or interesting. "Do you know what time of day it is?" he said. Ampleforth looked startled again. "I have hardly thought about it. They arrested me. It could have been 2 days ago. Perhaps 3. His eyes flitted around the walls, as though he half expected to find a window somewhere. "There is no difference between night and day in this place. I do not see how one can calculate the time." They talked desultorily for some minutes. Then, without apparent reason, a yell from the telescreen bade them to be silent. Winston sat quietly, his hands crossed. Ampleforth, too large to sit in comfort on the narrow bench, fidgeted from side to side, clasping his lank hands first round one knee and then round the other. The telescreen barked at him to keep still. Time passed, 20 minutes, an hour. It was difficult to judge. Once more there was the sound of boots outside. Winston's entrails contracted. Soon, very soon, perhaps in 5 minutes, perhaps now, the tramp of boots would mean that his own turn had come. The door opened. The cold-faced young officer stepped into the cell. With a brief movement of his hand, he indicated Ampleforth. "Room 101, he said. Ampleforth marched clumsily out between the guards, his face vaguely perturbed, but uncomprehending. What seemed like a long time passed. The pain in Winston's belly had revived. His mind sagged around and round on the same track, like a ball falling again and again into the same series of slots. He had only 6 thoughts: the pain of it in his belly, a piece of bread, the blood and the screaming, O'Brien, Julia, the razor blade. There was another spasm in his entrails. The heavy boots were approaching. As the door opened, the wave of air that it created brought in a powerful smell of cold sweat. Parsons walked into the cell. He was wearing khaki shorts and a sports shirt. This time Winston was startled into self-forgetfulness. "You here?" he said. Parsons gave Winston a glance in which there was neither interest nor surprise, but only misery. He began walking jerkily up and down, evidently unable to keep still. Each time he straightened his pudgy knees, it was apparent that they were trembling. His eyes had a wide-open staring look, as though he could not prevent himself from gazing at something in the middle distance. What are you here for?" said Winston. And we'll find out in the next chapter what Parsons is in there for. So we've been reading from George Orwell's 1984. This has been a really interesting read, and we're almost done, I believe. What page did we make it to? I've got time to check. 192. So we still have quite a ways to go, but yeah, we are really getting it done. Anyways, if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you'll support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.